Colonel David Carter remained still, his expression unreadable, but the weight in his chest pressed deeper. Not just from frustration, not just from the injustice of it all, but from the knowledge that this moment was no longer about him. It was about Private First Class Jason Reynolds, about every soldier who had ever given their life, about the unspoken promise that no one gets left behind. The murmurs had grown into something sharper, more purposeful. People weren't just watching, they were bearing witness. The older Marine in the USMC hat exhaled hard, shaking his head. His voice was low, steady, but carried the weight of something unshakable. This is a disgrace. A woman in the crowd clutched her purse tighter, her face a storm of anger and disbelief. My father served. He deserved better than this, and so does he, she said, gesturing toward Carter. The young woman with the phone live-streaming swallowed hard, but her hands didn't shake. People need to see this, she repeated, her voice gaining strength. The airline agent, the one who had first denied Carter, kept her eyes glued to the screen, fingers twitching at the keyboard like she wished she could undo the moment. But it was too late. The tide had shifted. Then, from the back of the crowd, a voice rose, clear and sharp. Let him through. The supervisor had returned, his face pale, jaw clenched. He wasn't looking at Carter anymore. He was looking at the crowd, the cameras, the eyes locked onto him, the weight of public scrutiny pressing against his shoulders. Carter didn't move at first. Didn't react. He had stood in places where silence carried the weight of lives, where a single word could mean life or death. This wasn't that. But it was still a battle, and he had won it without raising his voice. The agent hesitated, then typed something quickly. A beep. A boarding pass printed. The paper slid toward him across the counter. You're cleared to board, sir. Carter picked it up, his fingers pressing against the thin paper. Not a victory. Just a correction of a mistake that should never have happened. He turned slightly, eyes scanning the crowd. The Marine nodded at him, a small, sharp movement of respect. The young woman with the phone gave him a shaky smile, her stream still running. Others simply held his gaze, silent witnesses to a moment that shouldn't have needed an audience. Carter inhaled, squared his shoulders, and adjusted his hat. Then, without another word, he walked toward the gate. Not for himself. For Private First Class Jason Reynolds. For every soldier who never made it home. Colonel David Carter stood unmoving, his posture rigid, his face unreadable. But inside, a storm brewed. Not one of anger. He had trained too long, seen too much to let his emotions dictate his actions. No, this was something deeper. Disappointment. Not for himself, but for what this moment represented. The agent behind the counter looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. Her hands hovered uselessly over the keyboard, her eyes flickering between the crowd, the cameras, and the airline representative now standing beside her. She was no longer in control. None of them were. Then the Marine from earlier took a step forward, his presence commanding, his voice low but heavy with something unshakable. I've seen a lot of things in my time, he said, his voice like gravel. But I never thought I'd see the day when an American soldier, especially one escorting the remains of a brother in arms, was treated like this. The words landed like a slap. The terminal, already quiet, became eerily still. Even the overhead announcements, the usual din of flight updates and gate changes, felt like background noise, distant and irrelevant. The only sound that truly mattered now was the quiet beeping of phones, recording, streaming, capturing every second of this unfolding moment. A mother, holding her fussing baby, wasn't focused on soothing the child. She was staring at her phone, her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. Somewhere behind her, a man muttered under his breath. It's already trending. Carter didn't move. He didn't need to. The world was watching now. The airline staff had fallen into an awkward, frozen silence. The agent's hands trembled slightly as she clicked at the keyboard, as if desperately searching for a way to undo the moment. The supervisor was still missing, but it wouldn't matter now. They had already lost control. And then, like a wildfire catching dry grass, it spread. A young man in a hoodie let out a low whistle, shaking his head. Damn, this is everywhere now. A woman in a denim jacket gasped as she scrolled through her phone. Oh my God, she whispered to her husband. It's already on Facebook. The Marine pulled out his own phone and grunted. They don't even know what kind of storm they just started. And then, as if on cue, the airport's loudspeaker crackled to life. Attention passengers, due to unforeseen circumstances, Flight 237 to Phoenix will be delayed. We apologize for any inconvenience. A few groans rippled through the crowd, but no one really cared. Their attention was here, on this. On the uniformed soldier being denied his duty. Then, a woman near the windows gasped. "His on Twitter." She turned her phone toward the crowd, and people leaned in, their faces illuminated by the glow of their screens. A tweet, bold and unfiltered, stood out among the others. They just denied a black U.S. Army colonel his flight while escorting a fallen soldier's remains. This is how we treat our heroes. Let him fly. The numbers beneath it were climbing, retweets, comments, likes. The fire was spreading. Another notification. Another tweet. This one from a veteran advocacy group. "We are aware of the disgraceful incident happening at airport name. Our soldiers deserve better. Expect action." The murmur in the terminal shifted. No longer just passive outrage. Now it was expectant. The agent behind the counter let out a shaky breath, then turned and hurried toward the back, disappearing behind a frosted glass door. She wasn't coming back with an answer. She was coming back with damage control. Carter exhaled slowly. He had seen this before, not here, not like this, but in places where powerful people suddenly realized they had made the wrong enemy. And then, finally, the supervisor returned. But he wasn't alone. Beside him walked a man in a sleek navy suit, his airline ID clipped neatly to his pocket. His posture was stiff, his walk brisk, controlled, practiced. He was here to put out a fire. He stopped just short of the counter, scanning the scene. His eyes flickered between Carter, the Marine, and the rows of phones still recording. He cleared his throat. "Colonel, I apologize for the miscommunication. There seems to have been an error with our system, but we're working to get you on your flight as soon as possible." Miscommunication. Carter had been in the military long enough to know what that word really meant. It meant we got caught. It meant fix this before it costs us too much. He let the moment hang, watching as the airline representative shifted slightly under the weight of the silence. "I see," Carter finally said, his voice measured. "An error, you said." The rep nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. A regrettable mistake. We assure you it was not intentional." A scoff from the crowd. The Marine shook his head. The airline rep adjusted his tie, clearly uncomfortable. "We'd like to personally escort you to the gate now, Colonel. First-class accommodations, of course." First class. As if that was the point. Carter didn't respond right away. Instead, he let his gaze shift past the man, to the counter, to the agent who had so easily denied him before. The same one who had never even checked before saying no. He exhaled, slow and deliberate. "I appreciate the urgency," he said, "but I need to clarify something." The rep nodded quickly. "Of course." Carter's voice remained even. "If no one recorded this, if no one spoke up, would I still be standing here?" A beat of silence. The rep swallowed. "Sir, we—" "You don't need to answer," Carter interrupted. He already knew. And so did everyone else. A woman in the crowd murmured, "He's right." The airline rep tried again, his voice thinner now, stretched tight. "Sir, we sincerely apologize." Carter held his gaze. "We both know this isn't about an apology." A hush fell over the terminal. People weren't just angry anymore. They were disappointed. The rep knew he was losing control. His posture straightened, his tone shifted to something more authoritative. "Colonel, let's get you on your flight now." But before Carter could respond, a new voice cut in. "Sir." A young man in an airport security uniform had appeared at the counter, holding out a phone toward the airline rep. His expression was tight. "I think you should see this." The rep frowned, took the phone, and scrolled. His face paled. The Marine folded his arms. "Something wrong?" The rep didn't answer. But Carter already knew. The backlash had officially exploded beyond the airport. A major news outlet had picked up the story. The headline was blunt. U.S. Army colonel denied flight while escorting fallen soldier. Airline scrambles for answers. Below it, a video played. Footage from the terminal. The rep inhaled sharply, handed the phone back, and turned to Carter. His voice was thin, forced. "We deeply regret this situation. We'd like to issue a public statement clarifying." Carter cut him off. "The public already knows the truth." Silence. Then, he adjusted his hat. "I don't need first class. I don't need special treatment. I need respect. And so does the soldier I'm escorting." The rep swallowed hard. "Understood, sir." Carter squared his shoulders. "Now let me finish this mission." And just like that, the battle was won. But for the airline, the war had only just begun. A man in a dark blue suit strode into the scene with an air of authority that was undeniable. His posture, his presence, he wasn't just someone important. He was someone who mattered. People instinctively stepped aside as he approached. Even the airline staff, who had been struggling to keep control, seemed to shrink in his wake. His ID badge flashed briefly as he came to a stop in front of Colonel Carter, extending a hand. "Colonel," he said firmly, his voice crisp and unmistakably military. "I'm Major Thomas Beckett, Department of the Army. We've been informed of the situation." Carter shook his hand without hesitation. The grip was strong, steady, no pretense, no theatrics. He didn't need to ask how Beckett got here so quickly. The military doesn't hesitate when it comes to its own. Beckett turned to the airline representative, his eyes cold and assessing. "We are handling this now. Colonel Carter and the remains of Private First Class Reynolds will not be flying commercial." The airline rep blinked, thrown off balance. "Aye, sir, we were just about to." "You were just about to cover your tracks." Beckett's voice cut through the air like a blade, sharp, polite, but weighted with something undeniable. The rep flinched. Beckett glanced back at Carter, his tone measured but firm. "Sir, the Pentagon has arranged for a private military flight. Your transport is waiting." A ripple ran through the crowd. Whispers spread, eyes widened. The U.S. military had stepped in. This wasn't just an airline's mistake anymore. This was a national disgrace. Carter exhaled, not in relief, because he didn't need saving, but because the mission was finally back on course. He gave a small nod. "Understood, Major." Beckett turned back to the airline rep, his gaze unreadable. "This will be addressed." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Carter turned to the Marine who had stood beside him through all of this, the man who had refused to let him stand alone. He met his eyes, a silent understanding passing between them. "Appreciate you, brother." The Marine tipped his head. "We look out for our own." Carter gave the room one last glance. The people who had spoken up. The ones who had refused to let this slide. The ones who had made sure the world knew. He adjusted his uniform, squared his shoulders, and walked out. Not toward the gate. Not toward his seat on a commercial flight. But toward something bigger. The fallout. The airline thought the storm would pass. They thought a few apologies, a carefully crafted press release, and maybe a brief statement from their CEO would be enough. They thought wrong. The story spread like wildfire. News networks picked it up. Veterans organizations released statements condemning the airline's actions. Politicians weighed in, demanding accountability. Then came the financial hit. By the end of the week, the airline's stock had dropped. A trending hashtag calling for a boycott gained momentum. Customers flooded their social media, demanding answers. And then, the final blow. A lawsuit. A coalition of military advocacy groups filed a formal complaint against the airline for discrimination and failure to uphold service member protections. Under mounting pressure, the airline's CEO made a public appearance. He called it a regrettable misunderstanding. He announced that the employees involved had been placed on administrative leave. Too little. Too late. The real fight. Meanwhile, Colonel Carter continued his mission. He escorted Private First Class Jason Reynolds home. He stood by as the young soldier's family received him, for the last time. He didn't need the headlines. He didn't need the attention. He needed respect. And that was the real fight. Respect shouldn't be conditional. It shouldn't require a viral video or public outrage. It should be the standard. But that day, at that airport, something important had been proven. The Marine. The passengers who spoke up. The ones who refused to stay silent. They showed the world that when people stand together, injustice has no way to hide. So if you believe in accountability, if you believe in honoring those who serve, let your voice be heard. Because silence lets things like this happen again. And next time, it might not go viral.